Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, to take your source material and really cut through the noise, give you the most valuable insights. And today we're diving deep into some fascinating excerpts from a YouTube transcript. It's from the channel Zayo Mood, and it explores a really critical period, the life of Prophet Muhammad, focusing from when he first received revelation right up until his passing. So think of this as, getting a guided tour through a pretty rich historical landscape. We'll unpack the key events, the big turning points, and really try to understand the forces at play in those very early years of Islam. The idea is for you to walk away with a well-informed view, getting the essence of this whole narrative without having to, sift through every single detail yourself. Let's start our journey right at the very beginning.
Okay, so this account starts by looking at the period just before prophethood. It's what the source called Arhasad. Basically the precursors or signs indicating a prophet was coming. And the material notes, these were seen among both Arabs and Jews as well.
So like hints in the air, or maybe specific events people noticed.
Exactly. The source gives a few examples, things like the shock waves when Iwan Khosrow, the palace of the Persian emperor, was said to have shattered. There's also the spiritual idea of the jinn being barred from eavesdropping in the heavens.
Right, and wasn't there something more personal mentioned connected to his birth?
Yes, absolutely. The vision his mother, Amina, described, she saw a light coming from her that illuminated distant castles, Syria, Persia, Rome. And then there's that well-known incident from his childhood in Bani Sad, the miraculous splitting of his chest.
Okay, so those are presented as sort of signs, but what about him as a person, his character?
That's actually highlighted as maybe the most significant precursor. The source really stresses that above all these specific events, it was his renowned character, his honesty, his trustworthiness that was just undeniable even before any revelation. And this wasn't something claimed later. It was, attested to by everyone around him. His first wife, Khadija included, his reputation was solid.
And that reputation, that trust, must have been crucial when the first revelation happened in Cave Hira.
It really was. The account describes his practice of secluding himself for contemplation in Cave Hira, now Jabal al-Nur, especially during Ramadan. This would have been around August 610 CE. The source even pinpoints the 21st of Ramadan for that first revelation.
And this wasn't just a quiet moment of reflection, was it? Something pretty dramatic occurred.
Oh, profoundly dramatic. It was in that cave that he encountered the angel Gabriel. And the command was read, Iqra. But the prophet responded he wasn't a reader. So the source recounts Jibril pressing him powerfully 3 times, which led to the revelation of those first 5 verses of Surah Al-Alaq.
Wow. I mean, that sounds terrifying, overwhelming. He went home trembling, right?
Yes, absolutely shaken. He came back to Khadija saying, cover me, and her response is just so telling. Based completely on his character, she gave him this absolute reassurance. She said, by Allah, he will never disgrace you. She listed his virtues, supporting the needy bearing burdens, saying that's why God wouldn't abandon him. It says so much about him and about their relationship.
And it was Khadija then who took him to get advice from her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal.
Right. Waraka, who's described as this fascinating figure, a Christian, the source says, on the true religion. Khadija wanted him to hear the story. And when he heard it, Waraka immediately recognized Jibril. He called him the greater Namus, the same divine messenger who'd come to Moses.
So he basically validated the experience from his own religious understanding.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And he believed in Muhammad's prophethood right then and there. His reaction, as the source describes it, is quite poignant. He wished he was younger, strong enough to support the prophet when, and this is key, when his people would inevitably expel him.
So Waraka actually predicted that hostility.
He did. He prophesied that the prophet's own people would expel him, saying, no prophet before him came with a similar message without facing opposition. It really set the stage for the conflict to come.
Okay, so after that initial shock and validation, the call to Islam began, but quietly at first. The source mentions a secret phase.
That's right. Scholars might categorize the phases slightly differently, but yeah, the Meccan period definitely started with a private call. It was based on the command, warn your closest relatives.
And who was in that very first inner circle?
Initially, it was focused right on his household. Khadija, of course, his young cousin Ali, his freed slave Zayd ibn Haritha. But the source points out something maybe a bit surprising. Some of the very first converts were actually prominent Quraysh members outside his immediate family.
Oh, really? Who are we talking about?
People like Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, Talha ibn Ubaidullah, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, Zubayr ibn al-Awam, Arqam ibn Abi Arqam. Their early conversion shows he already had these strong, close ties with influential people in Mecca beyond just his own clan.
Okay, so for about 3 years, the message spreads quietly among this group. Then comes the command for the public call. Proclaim what you are commanded.
And the way he did it really grabbed everyone's attention. He went up Mount Safa, called out the Quraysh tribes by name, and he used this clever setup. He asked them, if I warned you about an enemy army behind this mountain, would you believe me? Their answer, immediate yes, because they'd never known him to lie.
There's that trustworthiness again. It
Yeah.
keeps coming up. And then he delivered the real message.
He did. He told them he was a warner, warning them of a severe punishment to come. And the reaction from some was immediate and hostile. The source really highlights Abu Lahab's infamous curse and rejection right there. That moment is said to have led directly to the revelation of Surah al-Nisa. That was kind of the public declaration of opposition.
Right, and this is where the source helps us understand the reasons behind Quraysh's really intense opposition. It wasn't just about disagreeing with the religion itself.
No, absolutely not. It was complex, multi-layered. First off, you had major economic interests. Quraysh was the big trading tribe. They were worried this new religion, critiquing idols and all that, would mess up their alliances, their trade routes with other tribes who relied on idol worship economically.
So their whole livelihood felt threatened.
Exactly. And second, look, individuals practicing other beliefs quietly, that might have been tolerated sometimes. But the Prophet's message publicly criticized their idolatry, their polytheism. This was a direct hit on their traditions, their social structure, the authority of the big families, and it got really alarming for them when young Meccans started converting.
That makes sense. It wasn't just personal belief. It felt like an attack on their whole society.
Yeah. And third, the source points to this deep-seated internal power struggle among the Quraysh clans themselves. There was fierce rivalry, especially between branches like Bani Hashim, the Prophet's clan, and Bani Umayyah, and also Bani Makhzum, Abu Yal's clan, who were wealthy and numerous. The source even quotes Abu Jal basically saying, we were neck and neck like racehorses with Bani Hashim, and now they claim a prophet among them. It clearly shows leadership competition was a huge factor.
Wow, so it was power, money, tradition, tribal status,
Yeah.
all wrapped up together. Much more than just theology.
Definitely. And the source names key figures leading the persecution. Abu Jal, who the Prophet called the pharaoh of this nation, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, known for torturing Bilal Aswad ibn Muttalib. It also notes the relative moderation of someone like Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, even though he opposed Islam, and crucially, the protection from his uncle, Abu Talib, who shielded him even without becoming Muslim himself.
So as the message went public, the persecution of those early believers ramped up.
It got really severe. The Prophet saw his followers suffering, and he couldn't fully protect them in Mecca. This situation basically pushed him to look for alternatives, for sanctuary elsewhere.
And the first place suggested was Abyssinia, right?
Yes, the first hijrah, the migration to Abyssinia. The Prophet advised some companions to go there because its king, the Najashi, had this reputation for justice. He wouldn't tolerate oppression. The source mentions 2 waves. First, a small group, maybe 11 men and 2 women, around the 5th year. Then a larger group, about 80 people later on.
That number, 80 people migrating, really shows how bad things must have gotten in Mecca.
It really does. And things got even tougher for the Prophet personally around year 10. It's known as the Year of Sorrow. In a short space of time, he lost his uncle Abu Talib, who gave him that political cover, and his wife Khadija, his rock, his first believer. Their deaths left him much more vulnerable, really forcing his hand to seek support outside Mecca.
And that led him to try Ta'if.
He traveled to Taif, a nearby city, hoping its leaders, the source mentions the sons of Masud from Thaqif, Abi Alil, Habib, Amr, might offer support. But the rejection wasn't just harsh words. They actually stirred up children and fools to harass him, to stone him. The account mentions his feet bleeding. It was incredibly painful.
This is heartbreaking, a complete rejection.
Yeah. After being driven out, he took refuge in a garden owned by Utbah and Shaiba ibn Rabi'a, ironically, 2 Quraysh leaders who opposed him. But it was there that this beautiful, unexpected moment happened with their slave, Adas.
Adas, the Christian slave from Nineveh.
That's him. When the Prophet took some grapes and said Bismillah before eating, Adas was surprised. He recognized something, perhaps. When Adas said he was from Nineveh, the Prophet immediately identified Jonah Yunus ibn Matta as his brother prophet. Hearing his own prophet acknowledged by this man who'd just been stoned, it struck Adas deeply. He embraced Islam right there. It's just a powerful moment of faith amidst terrible hardship.
But after Ta'if, he couldn't just walk back into Mecca unprotected.
No, he needed what they called Jawar protection under the existing tribal customs. And the source highlights that Mutim ibn Adi, who wasn't Muslim, granted him this protection. Abu Ghal even questioned Mutim, asking if he was a follower now or just protecting. Mutim confirmed, just protecting. It shows how those old customs still mattered, even with the religious conflict.
Okay, so Taif didn't work out, but the idea of finding sanctuary outside Mecca was still the goal. He kept presenting the message, especially during Hajj season.
Absolutely. Hajj was prime time. All these Arab tribes gathered in Mecca. The Prophet would approach them looking for any group that might offer refuge and support away from Mecca's pressure.
And this eventually led to those key meetings with people from Yathrib.
Yes, some pilgrims from Yathrib, the city that would become Medina, heard his message and were actually receptive. The source suggests maybe because of existing tensions in Yathrib, or perhaps they knew about Jewish prophecies of a coming prophet, making them more open.
These meetings led to the really important pledges of Aqaba.
Two crucial pledges. The first, Aqaba Allah, was around year 11 or 12 of prophethood. 12 men from Yathrib's main Arab tribes, Aus and Khazraj, met the prophet. This one's sometimes called the Pledge of Women because it focused on basic Islamic tenets, monotheism, honesty, not stealing, etc. But importantly, it did not include a commitment to fight.
So accepting the faith, but not yet defending it militarily.
Right. After this, the Prophet sent Musab ibn Umayr, a companion from Mecca, back with them to teach Islam and the Quran. And the source says Musab was incredibly successful. Islam spread rapidly in Yathrib.
And that success laid the groundwork for the second pledge.
The second pledge, Aqaba al-Thaniya, happened maybe a year later, year 12 or 13. A much bigger group from Yathrib came for Hajj, around 73 men and 2 women, and met the Prophet secretly.
And this pledge was different, significantly different.
Fundamentally, this was a pledge of protection, military support. They pledged to defend the Prophet as they defend their own families. The source mentions Abbas, the Prophet's uncle, still not Muslim then, was present. And he warned them, this is serious. This means war against everyone, especially Quraysh. Though the source adds a detail, they primarily pledged to fight within Yathrib to provide that secure base.
That sounds like a real binding alliance being formed.
It was the foundation. As part of it, the Prophet asked them to appoint 12 leaders, Naqibs, from among themselves.
So with Islam growing in Yathrib, this pledge of protection in place, and persecution still happening in Mecca, the path forward became pretty clear.
It did. Yathrib was the destination, the Hijra. The Prophet told his companions still in Mecca to start migrating there.
Quraysh must have seen this migration, their people, their potential influence, draining away to Yathrib as a massive danger.
Oh, absolutely. The source describes their meeting in Dar al-Nadwa, their assembly hall. They came up with this desperate plot. Get a young man from each tribe, and they'd all strike the Prophet at once. The idea was to spread the blood guilt, make it impossible for his clan, Bani Hashim, to seek revenge against any one tribe.
A brutal calculation.
It was. But the Prophet, warned of the plot, slipped out of Mecca secretly with Abu Bakr. And the source highlights this amazing detail. Even fleeing for his life, he left Ali behind temporarily to return all the trusts and valuables people, including his enemies, had left with him. Still the trustworthy.
Incredible. So instead of heading north to Yathrib right away, they went south.
Yes, a diversion. South to Cave Thar, hid there for 2 or 3 nights. The source recounts Abu Bakr's fear in the cave and the Prophet's famous reassurance. What do you think of 2 with whom Allah is the third? Echoed in the Quran, Surah at-Tawbah.
And they used a guide who wasn't even Muslim.
Right, Abdullah ibn Urayqit. He knew the back routes, helped them evade the search Quraysh launched.
And the searchers got close, didn't they?
Very close. They reached the cave area. The source tells the story of Suraqah ibn Malik, who tracked them, tempted by Quraysh's reward 100 camels. But Suraqah's horse kept stumbling, like something is stopping him. The Prophet even made a prophecy then about Suraqah one day wearing the bracelets of Khosrow, the Persian emperor.
Which seemed impossible at the time.
Totally impossible. But it came true later, under Umar. Suraqah was so affected by it all, he eventually became Muslim.
There's also that lovely story of Mabad during the journey.
Yeah, a really touching anecdote. They stopped at her tent, a simple Bedouin woman. She later described the Prophet's noble appearance, his calmness, to her husband. And the source relates this miracle of a barren sheep she had suddenly giving milk, enough for them all. Her husband realized from the description it was the man Quraysh was hunting. It's a story of finding kindness, blessings on a tough road.
And finally, the journey ended at Quba.
Yes, they arrived at Quba, just outside Yathrib, on a Monday in Rabi's al-Awwal.
And Quba holds a special place, doesn't it?
It does. The prophet stayed there, the source suggests, about 14 nights, based on reliable collections, and while there, he oversaw the building of the very first mosque in Islam, the Mosque of Quba, described as founded on piety. It was the first physical stake in their new home.
After Quba, he moved towards the main settlements of Yathrib.
Right. And as he passed through the different tribal areas, the Durs, people were just so eager to host him, calling out, inviting him, boasting about their strength, wanting the honor.
But he didn't choose based on who shouted loudest.
No, he famously let his camel choose, saying it was commanded. It finally knelt at this drying ground, a murbad owned by two orphans. That land was purchased, and it became the site for the Prophet's Mosque, the heart of the future city.
And while the mosque was being built, where did he stay?
He stayed at the house of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari for about 7 months. Out of humility, he took the ground floor, even though Abu Ayyub wanted him upstairs. And the source really emphasizes the incredible generosity of the Ansar, the local Muslims of Medina. Sa'ad ibn Ubadah, for instance, brought food daily for the Prophet and his household.
So the Ansar were welcoming right from the get-go, immensely supportive.
Their hospitality was crucial. And the source gives us a clear picture of Yathrib's makeup then. It wasn't really one city, more like a collection of community.
Who were the main groups there?
Well, you had the main Arab tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj. Their relationship was complex, often rivals. Then you had the Jewish tribes, Banu Kainuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. The source calls them relative newcomers, arriving centuries before, maybe 64 CE, fleeing Roman persecution. Some Arabs had converted to Judaism too. And these Jewish tribes had alliances with the Arab ones, Kainuqa with Khazraj, Qurayza with Aus. Nadir were seen as the most prominent, sort of like Bani Maksum back in Mecca.
And the city layout reflected this tribal patchwork.
Yeah, unlike centralized Mecca, Yathrib was more like scattered settlements, durs. Each tribe had its houses, farms, groves. The hijra, the migration, really started changing that, unifying it around the mosque.
Bringing all those migrants, the Muhajirun, from Mecca must have caused huge logistical problems. Housing, for instance.
Oh, absolutely. The source actually calls it the first housing crisis in Islam, but it stresses it wasn't just chaos, it was managed, organized.
How do they handle that?
They made a real effort. Single men were often housed together. The source mentions the house of Sa'd ibn Kathama, the house of the unmarried, hosted people like Bilal, Suhaib. Married families were separate. They also tried grouping relatives and allies together. And later, after the move from Quba into Medina proper, housing was sometimes even decided by drawing lots among the Ansar willing to host.
And beyond just housing, the Prophet established the famous brotherhood, the Mu'akkah.
Yeah, that came a few months after arrival. Its main purpose was to forge this really strong bond. Mutual support, cooperation. Remember, the Muhajirun had left everything, homes, businesses, wealth. Many were struggling, even getting sick from the new climate. The source mentions fever. The Brotherhood was designed to ease that burden, integrate them.
How did it work practically?
The Prophet paired up a Muhajir, a migrant, with an Ansari brother. The examples are really striking. Abu Bakr paired with Kharija ibn Zayd, Abdurrahman ibn Auf with Sa'd ibn Rabi'a. And Sa'd ibn Rabi'a's offer to Abdurrahman, literally offering him half his wealth, even one of his wives, it's just an incredible example of the Ansar's generosity.
And Abdurrahman's response, asking just to be shown the market.
Equally noble. He had a trading background, wanted to stand on his own feet. Really memorable.
And initially, this bond was incredibly strong, even including inheritance rights.
Yes, at first, the legal bond meant they could inherit from each other, but the source notes this was later changed, abrogated by Quranic verses that brought inheritance back to blood relatives. The verse essentially redefined it. Indeed, the believers are brothers, emphasizing the spiritual and community bond over the legal inheritance aspect.
But the emotional connection, the support, that continued.
Absolutely. That deep support network remained. The source gives an example later on, Talha ibn Abdullah's reaction when Ka'b ibn Malik's repentance was accepted, showing how strong those bonds stayed.
Now, think about the other groups in Medina. The source says most Arabs eventually became Muslim, but not all households right away. What about the Jewish tribes?
Right. Regarding the Jewish tribes, the source tackles why most didn't convert, even though they apparently knew a prophet was expected. Figures like Ibn al-Hayban have predicted one. The main reasons given in the source are, frankly, envy and malice. Resentment that prophethood came to an Arab not from Bani Israel, although, it points out, individuals like Abdullah ibn Salam did convert early on.
Okay. And around the same time as the Brotherhood came the Constitution of Medina.
The Sahifa, yeah. The source sees this as a really big deal. possibly the first written document organizing civil life in an Arab city. Totally new compared to the old oral traditions.
What was its main goal?
To lay down the rules for this new mixed community, how Muslims related to each other, and crucially, how Muslims related to non-Muslims, especially the Jewish tribes. It declared Medina a sanctuary, set rules for mutual defense the Jews would help pay if they fought alongside Muslims against an external enemy. It strictly banned helping Quraysh, that was high treason, basically. But it also kept existing social structures like aqwal for blood money, ensured help for debtors, and stated Muslims were one community against outsiders.
So it's like a blueprint for coexistence and defense in this new city-state.
Exactly, a vital legal and social framework. And the source stresses this came from the Prophet, underlining that his sunnah, his actions and words were a source of law and guidance, not just direct Quranic revelation.
So with the community set up, structured, the next challenge was asserting Medina's presence, securing its position.
That's where the early military expeditions come in. You have the Saraya, led by companions, and the Ghazawat, led by the Prophet himself. These weren't just random raids, they had clear strategic aims.
What were they trying to achieve with these?
Several things, really. First, just establishing Medina as a new power on the map. Second, securing those vital trade routes crucial for both Mecca and Medina. Third, trying to reclaim some of the wealth Quraysh had taken from the Muhajirun. And fourth, generally weakening Mecca's economy.
The early Ghazawat, the ones the Prophet led, seemed to involve diplomacy too.
Often, yeah. They frequently resulted in peace treaties, muwada or mahadana, with nearby tribes like Banu Damra or Banu Mudli. The goal was often neutrality or alliance, expanding Medina's influence and security zone without necessarily fighting immediately.
Whereas the early Saraya, led by companions, were more focused on direct action.
Their main target was intercepting Quraysh caravans carrying goods. And the source notes an interesting point here. Initially, only the Muhajirun took part in these offensive missions.
Why only the Muhajirun?
Because the second pledge of Aqaba, the agreement with the Ansar, was primarily about defending the Prophet within Medina. So the Ansar's initial role was defensive.
Got it. Ansar defends Muhajirun offense initially. Of course, Quraysh didn't just sit back.
No, they started hitting back. The source mentions Karz ibn Jabir al-Fihri raiding some Muslim livestock. That led to the Ghazwa of Safwan, where the Prophet pursued him but didn't actually catch him or fight.
And then came the incident at Nakhla, which stirred up controversy.
Right, the Syria of Abdullah ibn Jahsh, year 2 after Hijrah. He was sent with a small group just to monitor a Quraysh caravan. But fighting broke out, and the big issue was it happened during Rajab, one of the sacred months when fighting was traditionally forbidden. Amr ibn al-Hadrami, the caravan leader, was killed, and the caravan and captives were taken.
That must have caused a huge uproar.
Oh yeah. Outrage in Mecca, obviously, but also unease among some Muslims because of the sacred month violation. The Prophet was initially displeased, held the spoils, but then, the source says, revelation came down addressing it. Basically saying, yes, fighting in the sacred month is serious, but what Quraysh had done, expelling people from their homes, blocking access to the Kaaba, those were far greater sins.
So it put the incident into a larger context of ongoing aggression from Quraysh.
Exactly. The source calls Nakhla a prelude and facilitator for the big showdown that was coming. It definitely raised the temperature.
And that showdown arrived with the Battle of Badr.
Badr, really the turning point. The immediate trigger was a large Quraysh caravan led by Abu Sufyan heading back from Syria. The Prophet learned about it, saw an opportunity perhaps to gain resources, and encouraged companions to intercept it.
But Abu Sufyan was sharp, wasn't he? He got wind of the plan.
He did. He quickly changed the caravan's route, hugging the coast to avoid the Muslims, and he sent a fast rider, Damdam ibn Amr al-Ghifari, racing back to Mecca to scream for help to protect their wealth.
And Mecca responded in force.
The source says they rose up en masse. They were determined not just to protect the caravan, but to finally confront and crush this new Muslim power in Medina. Their army was about 1,000 strong.
Which dwarfed the Muslim force.
Hugely. The Muslims numbered only around 313. And remember, they'd set out thinking they were just intercepting a caravan, not facing a full-blown army.
But the source mentions a divine promise related to this confrontation.
Yes, it references a Quranic verse where Allah promised them victory over one of the two groups, either the caravan or the army. They naturally hoped for the easier one, the caravan, but Allah intended for the truth to be established through the battle itself.
Facing such odds, the Prophet consulted his followers, didn't he?
He did. He needed to know everyone was committed. The Muhajirun, like Abu Bakr and Miqdad, immediately pledged full support. But then he specifically turned to the Ansar, remembering their pledge was primarily for defense in Medina.
And Sa'd ibn Mu'adh's response was crucial here.
Absolutely pivotal. It locked in the Ansar's commitment to fight outside Medina. Sa'd, a leader of the Aus, basically said, "By Allah, if you let us into the sea, we'd follow. We're with you, fighting." That sealed it.
Even after the caravan was confirmed safe, the Quraysh army pushed on to Badr. Why?
Pride, arrogance, a determination to make a statement. Abu Sufyan sent word the caravan was safe, they could go back. But hardliners, led by Abu Jahl, insisted. They wanted to reach Badr, feast, show their strength, make sure, as the source puts it, Arabs would always fear them. Some, like Utbah ibn Rabi'a, advised turning back, but they were overruled or shamed into continuing.
The battle itself happened on the 17th of Ramadan, year 2.
And the source highlights factors beyond just numbers. Divine aid is mentioned rain that helped the Muslims but hindered Quraysh, the presence of angels fighting. But also, discipline. The Muslim camp was united following the Prophet's command. The Quraysh camp had internal rivalries and less cohesion.
It kicked off with duels, didn't it?
Yes, the traditional start. Quraysh champions Utbah, Shayba, Walid challenged. The Prophet sent champions from his own family, Hamza, Ali, Ubaidah. Ali and Hamza won quickly, a big morale boost.
And the battle resulted in devastating losses for the Quraysh leadership.
Catastrophic for them. So many key figures killed: Abi Jahl, Umayyah ibn Khalaf. It decapitated their political and military elite. A massive blow.
What happened to the prisoners the Muslims took?
About 70 were captured, and their treatment, the source notes, was remarkably humane. The Ansar, in particular, were known to give their captives better food than they ate themselves. Most were eventually ransomed. Some were freed without ransom if they promised not to fight Muslims again. Only 2, known for extreme, persistent hostility, were executed.
The impact of Badr must have been immense on both sides.
Huge. In Mecca, shock, disbelief. The source says they initially suppressed public mourning to project strength, but underneath, the calls for revenge were intense in Medina. Obviously great joy, relief, but also sorrow for the Muslims martyred.
And how did Badr affect the situation with the Jewish tribes in Medina?
It had a significant impact. The source points to Banu Qaynuqa, the goldsmiths. Their arrogance apparently grew after Badr. Tensions flared after an incident where they harassed a Muslim woman in their market. The Prophet besieged them. Abdullah ibn Ubay, the leader of the hypocrites, pleaded for them based on old alliances, so they weren't killed, but they were expelled from Medina.
So Badr led directly to the expulsion of one major Jewish tribe. The next big clash was Uhud.
Uhud, in Shawwal, year 3, the driving force. Pure revenge for Badr Quraysh. Used the profits from that rescued caravan to fund a bigger, better army, about 3,000 fighters, including allies like Abish and Ghatafan.
Revenge really seems like a constant theme here.
A powerful motivator. Some Quraysh leaders felt they'd personally failed at Badr, like Harith ibn Hisham, and were desperate for redemption. The source also mentions the Jewish poet Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf actively inciting Quraysh, praising those seeking vengeance.
And the Muslim force was smaller again at Uhud.
Started around 1,000, but then Abdullah ibn Ubay pulled out with about a third of the force, the Munafiqun, leaving around 700 Muslims.
The Prophet had a specific strategy in mind for Uhud, though.
His own preference was actually to fight defensively inside Medina, using the houses and alleys. But many younger companions were eager to meet the enemy in the open field, and he eventually agreed to their wish.
And a critical part of that plan involved archers on a hill.
Absolutely key tactical element. He positioned 50 archers on Mount Ruma, led by Abdullah ibn Jubair, with crystal clear orders: do not leave the spot no matter what happens, win or lose.
But that order wasn't followed.
Tragically, no. The Muslims had an initial success, pushed Quraysh back. Seeing the enemy seemingly flee, many archers thought the battle was won and rushed down the hill to collect spoils.
Leaving the flank exposed.
Wide open. Khalid ibn al-Walid, leading the Quraysh cavalry, brilliant tactician, not yet Muslim, saw the opening instantly. He wheeled his horsemen around the hill and smashed into the Muslim rear. It completely reversed the battle.
The Muslim losses were heavy and very personal.
Devastating. Many prominent companions fell martyr. Hamza, the Prophet's beloved uncle, his body was horrifically mutilated. Abdullah ibn Jash, Musab ibn Umair. The source also tells the moving story of Amr ibn al-Jamuh, who insisted on fighting despite a limp and died a martyr. Abdullah ibn Haram too. Anas ibn al-Nadr fought incredibly bravely.
And the Prophet himself was injured.
Yes, quite badly. He lost a tooth, was cut on the forehead, had helmet rings driven into his cheek. The source mentions his initial reaction to Hamza's mutilation was a vow of harsh revenge, but then revelation came counseling patience. And if you punish, punish with the like, but if you are patient, it is better.
So Uhud was a really painful defeat, a major setback.
Deeply painful, grief-filled Medina. And the source notes some Jewish groups actually rejoiced at the Muslim losses. Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf's continued inflammatory poetry after Uhud eventually led to him being dealt with.
After Uhud, tensions remained high with the other Jewish tribes, especially Banu Nadir.
Yes, relations were very strained, marked by broken agreements. The incident that led to Banu Nadir's expulsion happened when the Prophet went to their settlement. He was there to ask for their contribution to blood money, part of the Akwal system, for 2 men killed accidentally by a Muslim ally. While he was sitting there, waiting, some Banu Nadir leaders plotted to kill him by dropping a huge stone on him from a roof.
A clear assassination attempt.
Treachery.
Undeniable treachery. The Prophet was warned by revelation, got up abruptly, and left. He then laid siege to Banu Nadir for this betrayal. They were eventually expelled from Medina in year 4. They could take their movable property but had to leave their lands and fortresses. Surah al-Hashr in the Quran details this whole event.
And their expulsion actually helped the Muslims in a practical way. It did. The source points out that their confiscated lands and property helped ease the housing shortage for the Muhajirin significantly. The Prophet offered the wealth to the Muhajirin, and their Ansar graciously agreed, saying they were happy for their Muhajir brothers to become self-sufficient, even while they continued sharing their own homes. So after this, Banu Qurayza were the last major Jewish tribe left in Medina.
Despite the loss at Uhud, the conflicts didn't stop. They actually escalated into something even bigger. The Battle of Al-Azab, the Confederates, or the Trench.
Right. Year 5 after Hijra, Quraysh still hadn't given up on destroying the Muslim community. They put together this massive coalition, an Azab, bringing in various tribes, including the powerful Ghatafan, for one huge decisive attack on Medina.
This sounds like the biggest threat yet.
It was a formidable force. Faced with this, the Prophet adopted a novel defense strategy suggested by Salman al-Farisi, who was Persian. Dig a huge trench across the northern, most vulnerable approach to Medina. This completely baffled the Arabs. The source quotes Abu Sufyan saying, "By God, this is a stratagem the Arabs have never used before."
So it became a siege, not an open battle.
Primarily, yes. A long, grinding siege that lasted for weeks. The trench largely neutralized the attackers' cavalry advantage. The source describes the immense strain on the Muslims, the fear. The Quran captures it vividly, when the eyes grew wild and the hearts reached the throats.
Did any of the attackers manage to get across the trench?
A few did, at a narrower point. Some famous Quraysh horsemen managed to jump it, challenging the Muslims to duels. The source mentions Ammar ibn Abd, a legendary warrior, who was famously defeated and killed by Ali.
But the most dangerous moment came from inside Medina during the siege, didn't it?
That was the treachery of Banu Qurayza. While the Muslims were stretched thin defending the trench, Banu Qurayza, the last major Jewish tribe inside Medina, broke their treaty and effectively sided with the besieging Confederates. This created an internal front, a fifth column, putting the Muslim families, women and children in grave danger and massively increasing the pressure.
How did the Muslims manage to survive that double threat?
A key factor was a man named Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud. He'd recently become Muslim, but crucially, the Confederates and Banu Qurayza didn't know it. He went back and forth between Quraysh Ghatafan and Banu Qurayza, cleverly spreading misinformation and sowing deep distrust between them. He basically broke their alliance from within.
And the source mentions divine intervention again.
Yes. On a particularly cold, bitter night, Allah sent a fierce windstorm. It ripped down the Confederates' tents, overturned their cooking pots, extinguished their fires. It just added to the misery and chaos.
So the internal division planted by Nu'aym combined with the storm.
It broke their will. The Confederate army, demoralized, freezing, and now suspicious of each other, just disintegrated. Abu Sufyan gave the order to withdraw. They left without ever managing a full assault.
This failed siege feels like another major turning point.
Absolutely pivotal. The source highlights the Prophet's declaration right after the Confederates left. Now we will raid them and they will not raid us. This marks a fundamental shift. From this point on, the strategic initiative really passes to the Muslims. They go on the offensive.
And what happened to Banu Qurayza after the siege ended?
Their treachery during the siege was deemed extremely severe. As soon as the Confederates withdrew, the Prophet turned his attention to them. Their fate was put in the hands of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, a leader of the Aus tribe who had been their ally before Islam. He judged according to their own tradition, which, in this case of extreme treason during wartime, meant the execution of the fighting men and the enslavement of women and children. The source notes this judgment was confirmed as God's judgment. Some individuals who embraced Islam were spared.
So after the trench, that shift in initiative becomes really apparent.
Yeah, the source makes it clear the military balance tipped decisively. Quraysh was seriously weakened, Badr Uhud, and now the total failure of the Grand Alliance at the trench. They were losing momentum.
And the Muslim community in Medina just kept growing stronger.
Rapidly. Not just locals converting, but really significant figures from Quraysh itself started coming over. The source gives the examples of Khalid ibn al-Walid, their best general, Amr ibn al-As, Uthman ibn Talha, all major Quraysh figures who converted around year 6 or 7. The Prophet welcomed them, saying Mecca had basically thrown its heart to them.
Success in other campaigns probably helped too.
Definitely. Victories like the expedition against Banu Mustalik brought in resources, consolidated authority. You can see the trend in the numbers, from 313 at Badr to 10,000 at the conquest of Mecca a few years later. The direction was clear.
And a really key event in this period of growing strength was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
Hudaybiyah, year 6. This started with the Prophet leading companions from Medina towards Mecca, intending only to perform the Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage, peacefully. But Quraysh mobilized and blocked their entry just outside the city. Negotiations began.
The source mentions the choice of Uthman ibn Affan as the envoy was strategic.
Yes, Uthman had status and ties in Mecca, making him a suitable negotiator. While he was inside Mecca talking, a rumor swept through the Muslim camp that he'd been killed by Quraysh.
Which led to the Pledge of Ridwan.
A really powerful moment. Under a tree at Hudaybiyah, hearing the rumor about Uthman, the companions spontaneously pledged their loyalty to the Prophet, basically pledging to fight to the death if necessary. The Prophet even pledged with one hand for Uthman.
But Uthman wasn't killed, and a treaty was eventually agreed upon. But the terms seemed tough for the Muslims.
They did, initially. The treaty, negotiated by Suhail ibn Amr for Quraysh, said, Muslims go back this year, come back for Umrah next year for only 3 days, weapons sheathed, a 10-year truce. But the really contentious clause was, any man escaping from Mecca to Medina as a Muslim had to be returned to his guardian in Mecca. But anyone leaving Medina to go back to Mecca as an apostate would not be returned.
That sounds completely one-sided. How did the Muslims react?
Many companions, like Umar, were really upset. It felt like a humiliation. Totally unfair. But the source explains the Prophet's deeper wisdom here. That difficult condition actually backfired on Quraysh. Muslims who were returned often escaped again and formed this independent group on the coast, harassing Quraysh trade caravans. It got so bad that Quraysh themselves eventually came and asked the Prophet to please take these men into Medina, effectively canceling that clause themselves.
Wow, so what looked like a major concession actually turned into leverage.
Exactly. And perhaps even more importantly, the truce itself, the 10 years of peace, was incredibly beneficial. The source quotes the famous scholar Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, saying that more people converted to Islam in the period after Hudaybiyah than in all the years before it combined. Peace allowed people to interact, learn, reflect without the constant threat of war. And the treaty freed up the Prophet to deal with other threats, like the powerful Jewish settlement at Khaybar, without worrying about Quraysh.
Which he did the next year, the conquest of Khaybar.
Yes. Year 7. Khaybar was the last major Jewish stronghold, where many expelled groups had gathered. Taking Khaybar further consolidated Muslim power in the region. It fits perfectly with that post-trench declaration. Now we raid them.
So the source really paints a clear picture of how these events, the trench, Hudaybiyah, Khaybar, cemented Muslim dominance and paved the way for the eventual peaceful conquest of Mecca itself, even though it doesn't detail that final step.
Exactly. It shows the trajectory, how the balance of power definitively shifted.
Okay, so stepping back from all these details, looking at this incredible sweep of history from one man in the cave to building a city-state and becoming the dominant regional power, what are some of the big takeaways from this account?
Well, I think one thing that really stands out is how things that looked like setbacks or really difficult compromises like those terms at Hudaybiyah could actually, with strategic patience and vision, turn into advantages down the line. It wasn't always about winning every single immediate battle.
That's a really interesting point. Sometimes the path forward involves steps that feel like losses in the moment.
And the other thing is just the fundamental importance of, well, character and community. The Prophet's initial trustworthiness was vital, Khadijah's unwavering support, the incredible generosity and loyalty of the Ansar, welcoming strangers, sharing everything, the bonds built through things like the brotherhood. That was the bedrock. That's what allowed them to withstand immense pressure.
So it wasn't just about military strategy or political maneuvering. It was built on deep trust, support, and that strong community fabric.
Precisely. This deep dive really gives us a framework for understanding that progression from vulnerability and being on the defensive to gaining strength and taking the initiative.
And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? When you face what looks like insurmountable opposition, how crucial are things like strategic patience, those really strong internal community bonds, and maybe the ability to find strength or opportunity in unexpected places, whether it's, a sheep giving milk or a treaty that seems unfair at first.
Definitely something to reflect on, how those elements play out, not just in history, but maybe in any challenging situation.
Indeed. Something to think about until our next deep dive.